All right. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you, and hopefully you enjoyed that conversation. So now we're going to follow up with just about 20 minutes or so of live Q&A for our panelists who are here today. And so please feel free to drop those questions in the chat, whether you're on Whova or whether you're joining us through YouTube or through the live stream, and we'll try to address them as we can. So thanks again to our three great panelists. I'm hoping that we'll cover a little bit more, maybe get more into kind of the details of the things that we talked about in our conversation. So Danielle, I actually want to go to you first, kind of on this question of 5G and 4G was more commonly in certain parts of the Middle East, and even 6G now is kind of in the phase of being rolled out. So in general, kind of from a global, implementation perspective, what are some security and logistics concerns for countries that are kind of implementing or working with these technologies for the first time to consider? And how might some of these, 5G and 6G impact, certain elements of governance, communications, and balance of power, kind of from the global perspective? What are some takeaways you've had in your work at Palo Alto about this?
Good question. So, I think for a lot of countries, the security, if you guess about kind of security and logistics, the implications, as I mentioned in my remarks, they're huge, right? So 5G helps, it's underpinning digital transformation, whether that's in companies, including, companies potentially in the Middle East, but also governments. And the risks are greater than with the previous generations of technology. So I think as governments are looking at this area, one thing I really want to hit on is, what can they be doing, right? Because governments around the world all want 5G to roll out. They see the potential to their economies, and how can they be promoting that it be done so securely? I think a lot of them really know what's at stake. There's been some interesting approaches that we've seen being taken around the world. In some countries, like such as Singapore, if service providers are going to be bidding on spectrum or applying for spectrum, when they put together their bid package, security makes up a certain percentage of what they have to table and put forward. So how will they address those concerns? In other countries like Australia, it's not part of the spectrum allocation, but the Australian government is beginning to look at promoting something called clean pipes, which is the expectation that service providers have security in their networks, not just of DNS, but hopefully more broadly. In Europe, there's the European Telecom Law that requires service providers to take steps to secure their networks, leveraging state-of-the-art technologies, and some guidance has come out by the European Cybersecurity Agency about needing to think about slice-level security and containerized security and real-time monitoring of threats and prevention. So, to the geopolitical question, I think if 5G is going to be underpinning economies and including underpinning government, militaries and government communications, that imperative is even more important to figure out a way to incentivize that 5G be built with security baked in from the beginning. So I'll stop there and see if anyone has anything to add.
Yeah, Will and Srini, do you have any thoughts just kind of following up on that? Because there's a lot to dig into there.
The 5G particularly will be a combination of cloud and non-cloud. It's fully automated rollouts, deployments. So in addition to not only in terms of the clean pipes in the network, it also comes back into the infrastructure security. So there is a combination, and Danielle touched on this yesterday about the policy for the cloud local to that particular country or local to the geo. That also becomes important, right? It's not only that the cloud and from a network standpoint, the 5G is servicing from a network standpoint and the telecommunication standpoint, it also needs to have from a data protection standpoint and the related services that are rolled out through the 5G, because 5G provides a lot more capabilities, including connecting to a doorbell, right? So that end-to-end security and compliance, there is a policy requirement, and a regional policy or a local policy has to be looked into as well. So that will also help. Specific and prescriptive guidance for that will also help.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, kind of taking us back to that practical realm. Will, kind of keeping in with the 5G general category, you spoke a little bit during our remarks about sort of the concerns of emerging technology, diplomacy or influence on the part of China in the region specifically. And I wonder, I mean, there's been significant reporting about Chinese investments in 5G and these kinds of partnerships and in infrastructure in Egypt and other countries. Do you have any thoughts about kind of where the challenges and the threats are in that kind of pit and what we might consider as we watch closely to see how those relationships will develop in the future?
Sure. I think this is an issue that everyone is watching pretty closely. I think the challenges with 5G infrastructure and sort of the limited suppliers of some of the underlying core technology have been, limiting factors for hardware security and for, the creation of these secure networks, not just in the Middle East, but in the UK and other places. And so, when evaluating, the security of a supply chain, of course, you got to look at the source of the technology. And, China is a big player in that sort of core 5G infrastructure. And so, when you're installing that infrastructure, there's obviously opportunity to manipulate it. And, I think it's something where, the vulnerability is sort of well known, well documented. Actually seeing it out in the wild is, I think a little bit more complicated of a thing. I think it's a hard thing to prove, but it's one of those things that, once you install hardware that you don't control or do not understand, you sort of lose the ability to really secure it. And so I think that's the fear, particularly when you look at Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and some of the other states where there's a large U.S. military or security relationship. There is fear that running secure communications through those countries, sharing information, sharing data, sharing intelligence could be compromised if their 5G networks or some of the hardware that uses 5G networks, even things like internet connected doorknobs. We've seen examples of where everything from internet connected TVs to refrigerators can be compromised for malicious purposes. And so the vulnerabilities that some of the core infrastructure being compromised could create is really problematic. And China being one of the only suppliers of some of this technology, creates opportunities for problems.
Definitely. And I think that's something we've seen even in, some rural areas of the US, for example, where companies like Huawei have made significant investments because infrastructure is affordable and it works well. And so, yeah, there's a lot to consider there. So we have one question from the audience that I'll kind of throw out to all of you and see who might want to take a bite on it. So this question is from Brandon, and he says, with regard to IoT infrastructure, very, very few Middle Eastern nations have allocated spectrum for licensed IoT standards, with Gulf states allocating some licensed spectrum. And what's sort of the impact on the Middle East leaning away from licensed spectrum? And do more IoT standards, it looks specific IoT standard names that he names here, have questions for how that might be governed in the future? So sort of just the question about kind of licensing agreements and kind of regional, alignment on the IoT standards, which I guess it goes a little bit back to this 5G question. Does anyone have any thoughts on this?
I think a couple things in terms of the enablement of the technology, right? Whether the infrastructure by government allocated, particularly from a 5G rollout standpoint, and the IoTs and the OTs devices rollout standpoint, it has to be looked in the context of how they're being deployed, right? Whether they take the large companies like BP and others are taking spectrum and deploying their own private networks based on 5G technologies, for things like that, and they'll have a certain standards that the corporate will deploy. So that's number one. That's definitely there. Second part of it is in terms of the open standards. We talked about that in our opening remarks, is about how the governments and the policymakers enable these open standards or incentivize for companies, corporators, equipment makers to adopt to these open standards. So that way, it's more of a common standards across the globe, and it's easy to integrate and easy to deploy. So in terms of giving 2 points of view, it's a deployment methodologies and adopting to open standards will be important parts.
Yeah, definitely kind of eliminating that friction when it comes to creating infrastructure around security that works well in the long term. So we just have maybe 1 or 2 minutes left. So I kind of want to do a quick lightning round to each of you. So some governments, including the UAE and some in parts of Europe, have specifically designated sort of, diplomats or specific government representatives on certain emerging tech issues. So having a minister of AI or having a diplomat who works specifically just with tech companies. And I guess specifically on the question of AI specifically, just because of how it threads through a lot of these questions, if each of you got to be, global minister of AI for the day or whatever, but also have the added benefit of being able to implement something that you think really would make a meaningful difference in long-term security and use around automation, what might that be? And Danielle, can I go to you?
Sure. I think this comes up. We were talking before we went live about the fact that the UAE has a minister of AI, which, from what I understand, is the first or the only in the world. So very visionary. Obviously, thinking about what this means for the country in the future. AI has so many different uses, and we probably don't even know what they all are right now. I always look at these things from the cybersecurity perspective, so hopefully William and Srini will have others. But I think thinking about how AI can and should be used to improve the country's cybersecurity, I think is really worth the government's thinking about and reaching out to counterparts around the world, other governments and also industry, to say, how can we work on this together? Because particularly in the area of cybersecurity, all of us, or most of us, the governments and industry, we all want more security, right? So how can we all work together to beat the bad guys who themselves are working together? So, thinking about how to better leverage AI for this and where we need to invest and do more R&D, I think would be a great role for that person to take.
Yeah, absolutely. Will, any thoughts you have on this?
Sure. So, I, to be honest, don't even know where I would start in the position. I'm thankful not to have it myself. But I think, the way that I think the UAE is using it makes a lot of sense to me. So I think first and foremost, it's a signal of political will that they would dedicate, a cabinet member, a very small group of people responsible for government policy to dedicate to this. And I think, the role is really about organizing policy, a national strategy on artificial intelligence that covers everything from education to, technology development, transportation, and is responsible for monitoring and coordinating a lot of those activities is incredibly important. And then investment, governments, there is a finite number of things that you can invest, both actual resources, but also time and attention. And so I think setting those priorities, making those priorities known for the private sector, because only the private sector can achieve some of those things, and then following through with sort of attention and publicity, I think is how it's being used. And I think it's a pretty wise way of using a position like that. And I suspect that we'll see more things, if not AI specifically, then sort of cyber coordinators like we have in the United States to do similar things.
Yeah, I agree. And I hope that's the case. Srini, just on the last point, any thoughts you have on this question?
Again, we talked about team sport. And this is where the government agencies with the leaders, like the Minister for AI, and leaning into the capabilities that have been created. So IBM has a large amount of investment into AI through Watson and other technologies and utilities that we have created and open source them as well. So, and we've used this and we've learned from our own data and being able to automate, respond faster, mitigate threats, right? We have 73% of automation of alerts today. So leaning into those capabilities, learning from the successful implementations and bringing them into the region, developing the skills based on those capabilities available around the world, promoting that to be adopted into the universities, into the government agencies, into the corporations there, providing them the incentives will take this a long way.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's well said and a great note to end on. Well, thanks to our audience for questions and for joining us. I think we'll stop there for today, but please feel free to keep in touch with us, to keep the conversation going on social media, wherever you might be following along. And thank you again so much to all three of our panelists for joining us. And